My name is Eleanor Carter, but people in this part of Texas have only ever called me Ellie. Names here aren't just labels, they're stories, stitched into the land like the fences that stretch for miles. And mine, well, mine has weathered more seasons than most care to count. I am 76 years old, and I have spent every one of those years under a Texas sky that does not apologize. It blisters, it bruises, it blinds, but it never lies. If you've lived here long enough, you learn to stand a little straighter, squint a little harder, and walk like you've already survived the storm that's coming. My home is a small, sun-faded house outside Lubbock, the kind of place where the dirt road leading to the front porch remembers every tire that's ever rolled across it. The siding needs repainting, the gutters hang at an angle Arthur always promised he'd fix next Saturday, and the wind whistles through the old mesquite tree like it's trying to tell secrets about the past. Arthur, my husband, 49 years of marriage, 49 years of holding the same hand, even when life tried to tear our fingers apart. We bought that house when we were young, poor, and convinced that love could solve anything. He was a mechanic with grease beneath his nails no matter how much he scrubbed. I was a school cafeteria worker back then, later a receptionist at a plant that closed down long before I retired. We lived simply, but we lived fully. In that house, we raised 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and little Ben. In that house, Arthur carved our initials into the fence post. In that house, I held him when the doctor said the word cancer. And in that house, years later, I held his hand when it stopped trembling, forever. People say time heals, but time only teaches you how to hide the ache better. After Arthur passed, everything became a little too quiet. The floorboards still creaked, but they no longer followed his footsteps. The kettle still whistled, but it no longer meant 2 mugs on the counter. The porch swing still moved slightly when the wind pushed it, but not with the rhythm of his boots kicking the ground. I would sit there sometimes, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the sun dip behind the fields. Some evenings, if the wind blew just right, I'd swear I could smell his aftershave, that old cedar-scented one he bought from the discount bin every Christmas. But grief isn't something you defeat. It's something you carry. And I carried it alone. My children, well, they grew up. They moved on. Not unlovingly, I suppose, just distantly. Michael calls when he remembers, which isn't often. Sarah texts more than she visits. Ben pops in when he needs something, usually tools, sometimes money. They don't mean harm, not deliberately. But somewhere along the years, they stopped seeing me as their mother and started seeing me as a fragile responsibility held together by routine and stubbornness. You shouldn't be doing chores alone, Mom.
You're getting slower these days. Be careful. You're not as young as you think. They meant it kindly, but kindness without respect feels like a cage. The truth is, aging changes the way people speak to you long before it changes the way you feel inside. My body grew older, yes, but my spirit stayed sharp, observant, still certain of who I was. But the world doesn't look at older women and see strength. It sees expiration dates. It sees fragility. It sees inconvenience. And slowly, without even noticing when it happened, you begin to shrink inside conversations. You laugh softer, speak less, move carefully so no one worries. You become a quiet version of yourself, not because you are fading, but because everyone treats you like you already have. But Texas women don't disappear easily. We don't dissolve like sugar in rain. We endure. I endured through lonely holidays, through summers that cracked the soil, through winters that chilled the bones Arthur once warmed. I endured through the quiet judgment of my children, through the long afternoons when the house was so silent I could hear my heartbeat echo. I endured because that's what I was taught, because that's what every woman I ever admired did, because survival becomes habit long before it becomes choice. But beneath all that endurance, something else simmered. Something small, something patient, something fierce. A truth waiting to be spoken, a truth waiting to stand. I didn't know that this truth, this sleeping fire inside me, would ignite because of a single sentence spoken by someone who didn't even look me in the eyes. A sentence that would alter not just the course of my health, but the course of my dignity. The story truly begins on a day that looked like any other, sun-bleached, hot enough to sting the air, dust swirling across the road in thin, restless spirals. I woke feeling a little more tired than usual, a little more breathless, a little more human, perhaps. I brushed it off, as older women do, with a glass of water, a quiet prayer, and the belief that tomorrow would feel better. But tomorrow didn't. Nor did the next day. Nor the one after that. Sarah noticed, in the way children notice only when worry becomes convenient. "Mom, you need to see a doctor," she said, sighing like I was making her late. "You can't ignore this stuff anymore." I didn't want to go. Doctors have a way of talking around older patients instead of to them. But I agreed. Not because I feared for my life, but because I feared giving my daughter another reason to call me irresponsible. We drove without speaking. The radio hummed. The sky glared down at us in a white-hot blaze. And I sat quietly, fingers twisting around the strap of my purse, wondering when exactly I became someone people worried about, instead of someone people relied upon. I couldn't know then, I couldn't imagine, that in just a few hours, I would hear the sentence that split my life into before and after. A sentence spoken casually, indifferently, cruelly. A sentence that made the ground beneath me shift. A sentence that would awaken a strength I thought had been buried with Arthur. But that moment, that shift, that awakening, belongs to the next chapter. Sarah drove me to the hospital that afternoon with the kind of impatience people try to hide behind forced politeness. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel the entire ride, a rhythm of irritation, a rhythm that reminded me I was no longer the center of my children's concern. I was an interruption. The Texas sun glared through the windshield, turning the air inside the car thick and syrupy. Outside, the world shimmered in waves of heat that rose from the asphalt like ghosts drifting upward. We passed ranches, empty lots, a gas station with a sign flickering half its letters, all the familiar sights of a place that changes too slowly for the world to notice. No one spoke. Sarah scrolled through her phone at every red light. Occasionally she'd glance at me, not with worry, but with a kind of frustrated responsibility. "Mom, you've got to start taking things seriously," she said eventually, without looking up. "You can't just pretend you're fine." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because arguing felt like trying to shout through sand. We pulled into the hospital, a squat brown building that looked like it had been exhausted by decades of emergencies. I hated hospitals. I hated the smell of antiseptic trying and failing to mask fear. I hated the hum of fluorescent lights. I hated the way time froze inside them, like grief waiting in the corners. But mostly, I hated the memories. This was the same hospital where Arthur took his last breath, the same parking lot where I once sat alone in our truck, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, begging God not to take him. Walking through those doors again felt like walking backward into a nightmare that had never entirely let me go. Inside, the cold air slapped my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat outside. Sarah guided me toward the check-in counter, sighing when I moved too slowly. "Mom, do you need the wheelchair?" she asked, annoyed more than concerned. "No," I said softly, "I can walk." But she was already waving a nurse over, because sometimes people decide what you need before you've even spoken. They put me in a wheelchair anyway. I folded my hands in my lap, the way older women do when they're trying to hold on to some shred of dignity. The nurse pushed me down the hallway, the wheels squeaking with every turn. I could smell bleach, latex gloves, and the faint metallic scent of machines breathing for people who couldn't. They examined me, drew blood, checked my heart, asked questions I've answered 1,000 times. Any dizziness? Shortness of breath?
"Have you fainted? Any pain?" I answered as best I could, and each time the nurse wrote something down, with a face too still, too professional. That's how you know someone's holding back information. Their expression becomes a blank wall you aren't meant to climb. They moved me to a small room, divided by curtains. Machines beeped. Feet rushed past outside. Somewhere someone was crying, and someone else was shouting, and someone else was praying. Hospitals are places where life and death hold hands without ever looking at each other. Sarah sat in the corner, scrolling again. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly, and reminded myself I would survive this, Whatever this was, I had survived worse. After a while, 2 doctors approached. They didn't address me, even though I was fully awake. Instead, they stepped outside the curtain, where they found my children, all 3 now. Michael must have arrived while I was being examined. Ben, too, though he didn't say hello. Their voices murmured at first, then sharpened, then pierced. I wasn't meant to hear them, but God has a way of ensuring the wounded hear exactly what they're not supposed to. I shifted slightly, the thin mattress rustling. The curtain swayed just enough for their voices to slip through. "Her oxygen levels are low," the doctor said. "We need to run more tests." Michael sighed loudly. "How much is this going to cost?" The doctor hesitated. "We won't know until—" "Look," Ben interrupted. "She's old. She doesn't need every test under the sun. Just give her something basic so we can get her home." A coldness slid down my spine. Sarah's voice was tighter. "Mom's been declining. You should have seen her this week. She could barely get out of bed." I nearly spoke up. "That's not true. I was tired, yes, but not helpless." But my voice stayed trapped in my throat. Then came the sentence. The sentence that split the air. The sentence that split me. Michael exhaled sharply, frustration dripping from every word. "Honestly, don't waste medicine on her. She's already lived her life." For a moment, the world stopped. The machines continued their beeping. Footsteps moved in the hallway. Someone laughed in a distant room. But inside me, something shattered so quietly it felt like the sound of a soul cracking. Don't waste medicine on her. Don't waste medicine. On me. The doctor responded, shocked. "Sir, that's not how this works." "Just tell us if she's dying," Michael said flatly. "If she is, we need to start figuring out arrangements." Arrangements. They were talking about me like I was a broken appliance too expensive to repair, like my life had expired, like saving me was an inconvenience. Ben's voice joined in, low and careless. "We should save resources for people who actually have a future." The curtain blurred. My vision blurred. The edges of the room dissolved into a fog of disbelief.
My children, the babies I rocked to sleep, the little hands I held crossing streets, the mouths I fed, the tears I wiped, the futures I built, were discussing my survival like I was a piece of paperwork, worthless, disposable, burden. I felt my chest tighten, but not from illness, from heartbreak, the deepest kind, not loud, not theatrical, the kind that cracks silently, spreading through you like frost over glass. The doctor lowered his voice. "She can hear you, you know." Michael scoffed. "She's half out of it." I wasn't. I heard every syllable. I heard the truth behind their words, a truth more painful than any diagnosis. They no longer saw me as their mother. They saw me as a problem. The curtain swayed again as the doctor stepped inside. He looked at me with eyes full of apology, full of the things he wasn't allowed to say. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "we're going to run more tests. Don't worry." I nodded, but something inside me was no longer nodding. Something was rising. Something old. Something fierce. Something waiting for decades to remember its own power. Because when the people you love try to declare your worthlessness, you have only 2 choices: break or awaken. And in that hospital bed, under harsh fluorescent lights and the echo of my children's indifference, I awakened. The hours after the doctors wheeled me out for tests passed in a strange kind of slowness, like time itself was walking on uneven ground. They slid me into machines, drew more blood, placed cold sensors on my skin. Nurses spoke softly, but their voices felt distant, echoing through the fog that had settled inside my mind. But it wasn't confusion. It was clarity being born. Every cruel word I had heard from behind that curtain played over and over again like a warped recording. Don't waste medicine on her. She's already lived her life. Save resources for someone who still has a future. These weren't words spoken in panic. They weren't words spoken in fear. They were spoken in convenience, in irritation, in calculation. And something inside me, something that had been quiet for too many years, lifted its head. It didn't roar. It didn't scream.
It simply woke up. When they finally wheeled me back to the room, my children were gone. A nurse told me they had stepped out for a bit, but I knew better. They weren't stepping out. They were stepping away from responsibility, from affection, from the burden they believed I had become. For hours, I lay there in that curtained room staring at the ceiling tiles. Each one looked the same, yet somehow each one carried a different memory of my life, fragments rising to the surface like lanterns floating up into the night sky. I remembered rocking baby Michael in a chair Arthur built. I remembered braiding Sarah's hair for her first day of kindergarten. I remembered sitting on the bleachers during Ben's baseball games, cheering louder than anyone.
I remembered Christmas mornings, homemade birthday cakes, bandaged knees, school projects scattered across the kitchen. And I remembered something else, something so deeply buried I hadn't touched it in years. I remembered my worth. Not my worth as a mother, not my worth as a wife, not my worth as someone others needed, my worth as me. Eleanor Carter, a woman who survived droughts, losses, loneliness, bills that never stopped coming, roofs that leaked, cars that broke down, and a world that tried to shrink her with every passing decade. I had endured all of it. And now? Now my own children thought I was disposable. The thought didn't break me. It hardened me, like clay and fire. By the time my doctor returned with test results, my heart wasn't fragile anymore. It was focused. He sat beside my bed, eyes kind. "Your heart is stable, Mrs. Carter. Your oxygen levels dipped but recovered. You'll need treatment, rest, and some monitoring, but you're not dying." I nodded. Of course I wasn't dying. But part of me had, the part that still believed my children would protect me the way I once protected them. That belief needed to die in order for something stronger to take its place. My hands felt steadier than they had in days. The doctor hesitated before speaking again. "I heard some of the conversation earlier. I'm sorry." I swallowed, my voice low but firm. "I'm not." He blinked. "You're not?" "No," I said, meeting his eyes. He studied me for a moment, then nodded like he understood, in a way only people who have watched others survive can understand. That night in the hospital, tubes in my arm, monitors beeping in the dark, I didn't sleep much, but for the first time in years, my thoughts weren't tangled, they were precise. I realized 3 truths. Number 1, no one was coming to save me, not my children, not anyone else. Number 2, I was capable of saving myself. I always had been. Number 3, I would no longer be passive in my own life, not in my health, not in my decisions, not in my worth. Somewhere after midnight, I sat up in the bed, my body aching but my mind razor sharp. I took the little remote meant for calling nurses and placed it gently on the blanket. Then I whispered to myself, a whisper so soft it barely touched the air, but so certain it felt like steel. They don't get to decide when my story ends. When morning broke, sunlight seeped through the blinds in thin golden slits. The day felt new, not because of the sun, but because of the shift inside me. A nurse came in, cheerful. "You're looking better today." "I feel better," I said, and I meant it. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually, fundamentally. After breakfast, my doctor returned with discharge papers. "You'll need medication, follow-ups, lifestyle changes. But you're strong, Mrs. Carter. You'll recover." Strong. The word wrapped itself around me like armor. I nodded. "When can I leave?" "Today."
As I dressed, slowly, methodically, I felt something unfamiliar blossoming inside me. Not fear, not exhaustion. Purpose. The hospital bracelet slid off my wrist as if symbolically shedding an old identity, the identity of the woman my children believed me to be. Weak, dependent, diminished, burden. But I wasn't any of those things. I was a woman reborn. Outside the hospital, Sarah's car pulled up. She didn't get out. She didn't rush to help me. She simply unlocked the door and stared at her phone. I walked toward the car alone, back straight, chin lifted. She didn't notice the quiet shift in my posture, but she would soon. The ride home was silent until she finally said, "So, what did the doctor say?" "That I'm fine," I replied. "Well, you scared us. You can't keep doing this." "Doing what? Surviving? Existing?
being inconvenient to her schedule. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because the conversation I needed to have with my children would come later. Not in anger, not in weakness, in certainty. For the next several days, I recovered quietly in my home, drinking tea on the porch, watching the Texas sky stretch itself open at dusk, breathing in the scent of dry earth after a rare winter rain. My body was healing, but my determination was evolving. Every morning, I grew stronger. Every afternoon, clearer. Every night, braver. I began moving through my home with intention, checking files, reviewing accounts, understanding every detail of my life. Not because I feared losing control, but because I was preparing to take full control. My children thought they had already written the ending to my story. They had no idea. I was about to rewrite the entire book. In the days after my discharge, the world outside my window looked exactly the same. The same dry Texas fields, the same wide open sky, the same gravel road stretching past my front porch. And yet nothing inside me was the same. Something fundamental had shifted. Recovering at home wasn't passive rest. It was reclamation. Every morning before the sun fully rose, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and let the cool air fill my lungs. It stung a little, my ribs still tender, my breath not yet steady, but the sting reminded me I was alive, still here, still fighting. And with every passing day, I felt more like myself than I had in years. But feeling like myself wasn't enough. I needed to rebuild my life in a way that protected me, not from death, but from the slow erosion that comes from trusting people who no longer see your worth. I needed clarity. I needed boundaries. And I needed to understand exactly how far the damage had spread. So I began with the simplest step. I opened my files. My children assumed I didn't understand my finances. They assumed my mind was slipping. They assumed neglect was the same thing as innocence. But they were wrong. What I lacked wasn't ability. It was awareness. Awareness of how much they had changed.
Awareness of how deeply I had let their opinions shape mine. Awareness of the quiet ways they had begun making decisions for me, around me, without me. I pulled out folders, notebooks, statements, envelopes, medical bills, insurance notices, property tax letters, account summaries. Everything spread across the dining table like pieces of a puzzle I had ignored for too long. At first, I felt overwhelmed. Then I felt angry. Then, surprisingly, I felt capable. My handwriting on old notes was neat, clear, firm. My budgeting history was consistent. My payments were on time. My records were thorough. There was no decline, no confusion, no incompetence. Only a woman who had forgotten to honor her own strength. I took my time and reviewed every page, reading slowly, methodically, not because I needed to, but because I deserved to. Every bill paid, every signature mine, every decision deliberate. No chaos, no signs of a failing mind. But then I found something unsettling. 3 months earlier, someone had attempted to change the contact number on one of my accounts. The company had denied it because the caller couldn't verify the code sent to my home phone. My children never told me about that call, but I knew who it was. Not a stranger, not a scammer, a child who wanted to streamline things, a child who whispered in hallways, a child who said, "Don't waste medicine on her." Finding that attempted change lit a spark inside me, a spark of recognition, a spark of indignation, a spark of justice. They weren't just careless with their words. They were preparing to take control. Each discovery over the next few days reinforced that quiet truth. A password reset request I hadn't made, a voicemail deleted before I heard it, a missing brochure from my insurance company that should have arrived in November. When patterns appear, only 2 options exist: ignore them or follow them. For most of my life, I ignored warning signs because love asks you to, because motherhood blinds you to the shifting shadows in your own home, because forgiveness turns into habit. But not anymore.
Now I followed the patterns. Every time I found something suspicious, I wrote it down in a notebook I kept inside the kitchen drawer, not out of paranoia, out of preparation. Health makes you vulnerable. Age makes you invisible. But documentation makes you powerful. Still, I knew the truth. I couldn't fight this alone. My children weren't villains, but they were dangerous in their entitlement, dangerous in their indifference, dangerous in their certainty that they knew what was best for me, even if it meant silencing me. And danger must be met with structure, not panic. So, on the 7th morning after coming home, after watching the sun rise over the brittle winter grass, I took my keys, slid into my old pickup truck, and drove into town. Not to a doctor, not to a lawyer, not to a bank, to the community center.
And specifically, to Linda Avery, a retired nurse and volunteer patient advocate who spent her golden years helping older folks untangle medical and financial confusion. Linda was a storm in a sweater vest, sharp, observant, full of quiet rage at the injustices she witnessed daily. She had once overseen patient care at the very hospital where I'd been insulted behind the curtain. When I walked into her small office, decorated with knitted wall hangings and pamphlets about Medicare, she looked up and smiled gently. "Eleanor," she said, "you look awake." "I feel awake," I answered. She motioned for me to sit. "Tell me everything." So I told her, not just about the hospital, not just about the overheard words, but about the shifting behaviors, the attempted account access, the forgotten respect, the quiet insults that had grown roots in my home. She listened without interrupting, a rare gift. When I finished, she didn't give me platitudes. She didn't excuse my children's behavior. She didn't tell me to be patient with them. She leaned forward, placed her hand over mine, and said, "Eleanor, what they said in that hospital room wasn't just cruel. It was strategic." The word hit me like a cold wind. Strategic. She continued, "Some families push for do not resuscitate orders without understanding them. Others pressure doctors to limit care based on age. Some try to take over financial or medical decisions for convenience, not necessity." My breath tightened. Convenience. As if my life were an inconvenience. Linda reached into her desk and pulled out a folder. "These," she said, "are your rights. And this," she tapped her pen on the papers I'd brought, "is the beginning of your defense." I swallowed. "Do I need a defense?" "Everyone your age does," she answered firmly, "especially the ones who think they don't." Then she said something that would change the entire direction of my life. "We're going to create a medical directive and a financial protection file, not because you're declining, but because you're competent. Competent adults put their wishes in writing so no one else gets to rewrite them." I stared at her. "You're telling me," I whispered, "that I can decide my own care, even if others think I shouldn't?" Linda smiled, not softly, but proudly. "You're telling me you didn't know that." Warmth flooded my chest. Not embarrassment, not fear. Relief. Relief so deep it felt like someone had finally opened a window inside me. For the next 3 hours, Linda and I worked through every document: medical directives, emergency contacts, rights to treatment, information release authorizations, financial safeguards. She explained everything in clear language, treating me not as a fragile elder, but as a woman of intelligence and experience. By the end, I didn't just feel protected. I felt rebuilt. Stronger, sharper, more present in myself. A woman with a voice. A woman with boundaries. A woman with clarity. A woman with a plan. When I stood to leave, Linda squeezed my hand. "You're not done," she warned. "This is only the foundation. The real test will come when your children realize you've taken back control." "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time, I truly was. Back in my truck, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes, once dulled by disappointment, now held something bright, something fierce. Not youth, not rebellion, self-respect. A woman who has rediscovered her own strength becomes a force the world is rarely prepared for, and I had only just begun. The confrontation didn't happen the way I expected.
It didn't come as a dramatic shout. It didn't come as a slammed door. It didn't come wrapped in rage. It came quietly, the way storms often do in Texas, with a stillness so heavy that you know something is shifting in the sky. 3 days after meeting with Linda, after organizing every document into neat folders, after setting up all the protections she urged me to put in place, I received a text from my oldest daughter, Paige. "We need to talk, all of us, tonight." I stared at the screen, feeling a flicker of something that used to be fear and now felt more like readiness. I typed only one word back, "Okay." For the rest of the afternoon, I cleaned my house. Not because I wanted it spotless, but because I wanted it mine. Everything in its rightful place, everything chosen, everything under my ownership. Control isn't loud. Control is placement. As the sun dipped behind the mesquite trees, 3 headlights turned into my driveway. Paige arrived first, arms crossed, hair pulled back tight, carrying herself with the brittle authority of someone who thinks responsibility gives them ownership. Mark, my middle child, followed, quiet, stern, expression unreadable. Then Lily, the youngest, shoulders slouched, eyes soft, the only one whose guilt shows before her excuses do. They walked in without waiting for me to invite them, a habit they had learned slowly, and I had allowed even more slowly. But habits die the moment you stop participating in them. "Shoes off," I said calmly. They froze, stunned, because I hadn't said that phrase in years, because I hadn't requested anything in years. Paige frowned but slipped her heels off. Mark obeyed silently. Lily whispered sorry as she placed hers neatly by the door. They sat in the living room where Arthur's old recliner still faced the window. The room felt smaller with all of them inside, not because of its size, but because of the weight of unspoken things. Paige started immediately. "Mom, what's going on? The hospital called and said you updated your advance directive. The bank said your accounts are locked. Your insurance says you placed restrictions on who can access your information." She took a breath. "Why would you do all that without telling us?"
I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something that might have broken me months ago. She wasn't angry because she cared. She was angry because she lost access. Mark leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Mom, we just want to make sure you're safe." Safe. The word that had become a leash around the necks of too many older women. I placed my hands on the table between us, palms down, steady. "I did it," I said, "because I heard what you said in the hospital." The silence thickened. Paige's face went pale. Mark stiffened. Lily swallowed hard. "You heard?" Lily whispered. "All of it." My voice did not waver. The whispers, the jokes, the decisions made over my body as if I were already gone. Mark opened his mouth, but I held up a hand. "No, you don't get to interrupt. Not tonight." He closed it again. I let the words hang, let them sit heavy in the room, let them travel into the corners where denial usually hides. "I heard you say not to waste medicine on me." Paige flinched as if struck. Lily covered her mouth. Mark looked away. "I heard you question my mind. I heard you dismiss my life. I heard you treat me as if my value ended the moment I became inconvenient." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. "I am not confused," I continued. "I am not fading. I am not someone you get to manage." Paige's voice cracked. "Mom, that's not fair." "What wasn't fair," I said gently, "was listening to my own children discuss my worth like it was a number on a chart." She looked down. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks like the desert wind, soft but relentless. "I made decisions," I said, "to protect myself. Not from strangers. From the people who should have protected me first." "That's not what we meant," Mark muttered. "Then explain," I said. "Explain why the first thing you discussed that day wasn't my recovery, but how much care I deserved." Lily broke. Tears filled her eyes, and she spoke before the other two could stop her. "We were scared, Mom. We didn't know how serious it was. We didn't know what to do." And she looked at her siblings, then back at me. "It was easier to distance ourselves if we pretended you were already slipping." Her voice cracked. "I'm so sorry, truly." I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed. Lily had always been the one whose heart showed first. Paige stood abruptly and paced. We were worried about responsibility, she said, about who would handle what if something happened. You haven't been the same since Dad. I lifted my head sharply. Don't use grief as evidence of decline. She stopped. Silence pressed in around us. When your father died, I didn't crumble, I said. I kept this house running. I paid every bill. I drove myself to every appointment. I volunteered. I cooked. I lived. Paige's eyes softened, just barely.
I continued, and I would still be living in peace if my own children hadn't decided I was someone who needed to be managed instead of loved. Lily cried quietly. Mark looked ashamed. Paige finally sat again, her shoulders sagging. We were wrong, she said quietly. We were so wrong. I nodded once, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in acknowledgement. I'm not asking for perfection, I said. I'm asking for respect. Another long silence. Then I pushed the folder across the coffee table, the one Linda helped me prepare. What's this? Mark asked. My decisions, I answered. Written, signed, witnessed, filed. Medical, financial, legal. Paige flipped through it slowly, her hands trembling. You don't need to control anything, I said. You don't get to threaten my autonomy. You don't get to dismiss my voice. And you certainly don't get to decide when I stop deserving care. No one spoke. Lily finally whispered, What do you want from us now? I looked at each of them, really looked, and felt something surprising. Not bitterness, not triumph, just clarity. I want honesty, I said. I want effort. I want you to talk to me, not about me. Paige nodded slowly. And I want you, I added softly, to understand that I ended nothing out of anger. They looked confused. I continued. I ended the fear. I ended your control. I ended the silence that let you believe my life was no longer mine. They stared at me. The mother they thought they knew, now someone far stronger. And if you want a relationship with me, I finished, you will rebuild it from respect upward, not convenience downward. No shouting, no threats, no ultimatums. Just truth. The hardest truth they had ever heard. After several long seconds, Lily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, trembling, apologizing, real. Paige followed, slower, stiffer, but sincere. Mark placed a hand on my shoulder, a quiet gesture, but a meaningful one. They left that night quieter than they arrived, not defeated, but awakened. The sky above Texas stretched wide and dark as their car pulled away. I closed the door behind them, leaned against it, and let out a breath I felt in my bones. I wasn't just alive. I was here, present, autonomous, respected. A woman who had saved her own dignity when others tried to write the final chapter of her story. A woman who proved them wrong. And if you're listening, wherever you are, whatever age you are, hear me clearly. They don't get to decide your worth. They don't get to decide your care. They don't get to decide when your story ends. That power belongs only to you. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories of justice, resilience, and the quiet strength of women who refuse to be underestimated. Because somewhere out there, another woman is rediscovering her voice. And maybe that woman is you.